Surprise Podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen.
And here we are.
And we had to re-record this for the first time ever, knock on wood.
Yeah. And luckily it's just an intro and not a whole episode, because we wouldn't have been able to do it if it were a whole episode with a guest. That would be cruel to ask the guest to do.
I mean, I would ask just in case, but oh my goodness.
Oh, how bad we would feel.
Yeah. Anyway, let's hope this one sticks.
Yeah. And it's going to be surreal talking about something that we just talked about recently to each other again. It's okay.
Yeah, we just talked about it yesterday, so at least it wasn't like 30 minutes ago. Somehow that feels less bad.
It's true.
Anyway, speaking of, so we were talking about Seth Meyers and Philly.
Yeah. So I feel like people in Philly, from what I've learned ever since we released our Philly episode with Betsy Sneller, that people in Philly love to talk about Philly. So
yes,
hopefully everyone is very happy to hear more about Philly.
Except not so much the bad stuff that Seth Meyers had to say.
Yes. Unfortunately, he attacked the Philly accent.
Yes. And in a non-fun way, like not even interest. Like, I don't know. First it was like some lexical items, which fine, you know, sometimes it's kind of fun to like talk about lexical items. But then, of course, the accent. And then basically hoping that Philadelphians would all die so that their accent would die.
Yeah.
Just uncomfortable.
Hey, Philly accents, I hate to whiz on your hoagie, but you're something we could all do without. You're the grossest regional dialect. You make Boston sound like the Queen's English, and why do you talk like that? Are you mad you can't get good bagels in Philly because of the wooder? Or is your tongue burnt from licking the scrapple pan? I'll be honest, I hope Mayor Easttown never catches this murderer so we can off a few more of you people. Philly accents, time to get up out of this, John, because you's burnt.
And it's from a segment where it's like, you burnt, and he just goes through things and basically cancels them. I hate using that word now because it's been ruined.
It's been skunked, yeah.
Skunked. Oh, is that the technical term?
That is the, I guess, technical term, yes.
Yeah. You know, goes through things like, I don't know. Just, it's supposed to be silly. Sure. Yes, absolutely. Comedy is supposed to be silly. Often. But the problem with this, and I think about it in terms of how I watch Seth Meyers, and he seems to have like a fake beef with Philly that has extended over years. And so that context perhaps, you know, helps explain it. But the thing about all of this like accent, making fun of accents or saying that this accent's bad or whatever, is that often people see it out of context, or often people don't have like the background knowledge to know that that kind of stuff is actually quite harmful, and we see people get fired or, you know, discriminated against in other ways because of their accent. That's the context that's missing.
Yeah, he seems to think it's acceptable to mock a regional accent. I don't know why, but I mean, like, I guess just because everybody thinks it's acceptable. But it is more problematic the more difficult it is for someone to live their life and get jobs.
Right.
You know, like be treated with respect. And sure, a white person from Philadelphia, it's not going to suffer as many consequences as a black person from literally anywhere in the United States, but it's still, there is still harm being done to Philadelphians who use this particular variety of English that he is mocking.
Absolutely. And so, you know, when linguists or other people who know this, you know, people from Philadelphia or whatever, point this out, in this case, because it could be like a Southern dialect or Appalachian dialect, whoever is the person that points this out to someone, it always seems like they're trying to be a killjoy, but it's very real. Like, this is a very real issue that people have the right to bring up.
Yeah. I mean, it lays the ground for worse behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe in this case, if knowing that he always mocks Philadelphia, maybe it comes across differently. But for me, the real thing is, because I don't watch him, I've never really watched him. Don't really know why, just didn't. But he the fact that he like mocks murdering them, that's where I'm like really upset. Like, and then mocking their accent, you can do it in a way that's not as scary. At least this one is just, to me, terrifying. Like, I don't know. I know it's nowhere near like actually murdering people, but it just feels like you're down the road of like feeling like that's an acceptable response.
Well, in the clip, so he uses a bunch of lexical items that have been like stereotypically associated with the Philly accent, like bagel pronunciation and John and other things. And for some reason, people lately have been latching onto the word murder as if Philly. You mentioned that people in Philly don't actually say it differently, do they? Than like you or me.
Murder, I think they say murder like pretty much the same way most people in North America say murder. The reason why he brought it up, I think, was because of the TV show Mayor of Easttown, but also the NSL sketch making fun of it called Murder Dirter.
Right.
Which is apparently not the way that Philadelphians actually say, or anyone in Pennsylvania pronounces daughter.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
I think it's more like daughter, but again, I'm not the
right.
politician, so
kind of like it would rhyme with water, how they say water, right?
Probably. Yeah. That's a good guess anyway. Water, daughter. Yeah, that's probably right. Mm-hmm. Feel free to correct us if we're wrong.
Oh yeah, please.
But, yeah. But yeah, so it felt weird to use the murder thing, even though I understand like the connection. Like I can draw the line through the dots, getting to murder as a thing to talk about. But it just, I don't know, it makes my skin crawl when comedians are joking about murder.
Yeah.
Like in this way, anyway. I don't know. There's probably a way to joke about murder that would not make my skin crawl, but this one did.
Yeah. So. Maybe the jokes fell flat, and also
his affect was really flat. I don't know. It was weird. Is that how he always is?
No. Well, I feel like it has been lately because of COVID and just being tired of it all. Because not having a studio audience and stuff. So I feel like he's been...
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, I won't mock him for that because I understand that feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
All too well.
Yeah. Yeah. So, no, I've not tried to defend him more than to say, like, here's the context of it, but yeah.
Yeah, I think if he had just stopped short of the murder thing, I don't think I would have really cared that much. Like, it's not great to make fun of someone's accent, but, like, we all do it, and comedians do it a lot, and as long as you're not being, like, really wretched about it, I'll just ignore it. But this was just... it crossed the line for me. Anyway.
It would be helpful if everyone listened to our show so that they knew when comedians did these things, they could pause and say, oh, I know what you're doing. And every dialect and variety is equal. And then move on.
Every variety and dialect is equal. And once everyone believes that, then I think it'll be easier to mock other people's dialects because it won't matter.
Absolutely. Exactly.
As much. So, you know, comedians, you should, like, try to make sure that we all are on the same page so you get to make your silly jokes.
Yeah, exactly. There should just be an asterisk, like, on the screen, and at the bottom it says, all varieties are made equal.
Even that would help a little.
Yeah, exactly.
Footnotes on TV.
Oh, was that a really academic thing to say? To suggest to have footnotes?
I think on TV they do use things like that, but it does feel kind of academic. Yeah.
Taking away the fun from everything, that's what we do. No, I just want you to be like, careful and responsible as consumers of media. That's what we all should try to do. Ugh.
Yes. Oh my goodness, yes.
Yes, so.
Anyway, so today's episode is pretty fun, and you get to hear some interesting sounds because our guest is in Mexico, and it was really fun, like roosters and chickens and other birds and...
A taste of Mexican life in some parts of Mexico.
Hammering, like construction noise, and then on your end, there's some dogs at one point. There was no way for me to cut it out. So
Rilo and Nico,
people will be fine with it.
Yeah. They're just saying hi. And quick note that our guest, Elena Costello, is now Dr. Elena. So
yes. So congratulations.
Because we have congratulations. We have a backlog of shows that we want you all to hear, but this is what happens. Some things change in the meantime. So
yeah, a lot of things changed in the meantime. Canada's no longer so far behind the United States in vaccination rates. Fully vaccinated, yes, we were super far behind, but now single vaccinations, I think we're on par with the United States. So I feel a little less stressed about that, and so I kind of took all that stuff out.
Yeah.
It just didn't feel relevant anymore.
Right. It felt like you were whining about something because that thing wasn't there anymore. So like, why are you talking about this? Yeah. I get it.
Yeah. Anyway, so enjoy. Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
I'm really excited today to say that we have Elena Costello Sinsun, who is a PhD candidate at The Ohio State University in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, where she studies language and identity. Her areas of expertise include heritage language learners as part of Latinx cultural studies, the role of interpreters in healthcare, and accessibility to healthcare based on cultures, discourses, and practices of health, with a focus on race, equity, and inclusion. She has worked as a medical interpreter, and she teaches heritage language speakers how to be medical interpreters. She managed a Spanish language primary care practice in the United States, Clínica Latina, for 15 years. And she also started the Scholars of Color in Linguistics, which is amazing. Oh, and you're going to defend your dissertation in like a second, in like 3 weeks, right?
I'm defending very soon.
That's really exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And before we get into healthcare interpretation, COVID, the vaccine rollout, and all that, you're kind of celebrating something really fun. So you teach heritage language speakers how to be medical interpreters in Mexico, right? Mostly?
I do have both. I'm teaching right now medical interpretation to bilingual Latino high school students through the university. So when I was in a high school, I enrolled in the university. I'm the first woman in my family to finish high school and the first person to go to college. And the way that I did that was I took classes in Spanish because I already spoke Spanish at the university. So it was my way to sneak in while still in high school. And then I started working as an advisor in the university, and I realized this was a way that I could get Latino kids in who usually wouldn't be allowed in, because you can break all the rules that are required to get in if you excel or have an exceptional ability in some area. And so I argued that heritage language learners have an exceptional skill in Spanish, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that what we could do is do a 2-year program to train them to be medical interpreters. So they take different courses in different departments, like communications, geography, and Spanish and Portuguese. So they get background on cultural and ideas behind healthcare, but also the language part of it. And then after 2 years, they take the national certification test, and they are nationally certified interpreters. So I'm teaching that right now at Ohio State online because of COVID. And then in Mexico City, I've also been training repatriated people, so people that were deported or chose to came back. And I use the term chose very loosely because maybe their mom got sent back, so the whole family came back. So you didn't really choose, but you kind of did. So they've, I've been training them on medical interpretation, and just helped. We launched a cooperative on February 1st.
Yeah. Can you just tell us a little bit about the cooperative that just launched?
So it's run all by repatriated people, so people who grew up in the United States. I think the shortest amount of time for anyone in the group is 8 years that they spent in the U.S., but always like as children or adolescents, right? Most of them spent, they're like 23 and they spent 22 years in the U.S. There's a lot of that. And people think it's pretty easy to find work in Mexico, and it's actually really hard. Or they'll think, oh, you're just bilingual. But one of the great things that I found is there's no national medical interpreting agency in Mexico. So they've launched the first.
That's so cool. That's really, really cool. And you keep in contact with them, and you're still part of that cooperative, or do you consult with them? Awesome.
So I keep trying to tell them that I'm the consultant because I'm trying to stay as hands off and let them run it, but I've done all the trainings with them. So no, I talk to them daily about it.
That's amazing. Well, congratulations to you and to them.
Thank you.
That's fantastic. Okay, so let's get into it. What is the role of interpreters in healthcare?
It's both language and culture. So it's to get the meaning of the message across and not just the literal translation. So, for example, sometimes there's actually a phenomenon, I can't ever say that word, phenomena, in healthcare, medical healthcare, where people will be like, we'll just get through it without an interpreter, or they speak English well enough, but that then lacks the cultural component, right? So, for example, I was working in a hospital, and I was the interpreter in the hospital. They could have called me at any point. They had it. And they called me, and they're like, Mom's really upset. We were doing fine, and we were just getting by. Can you come up and help, right? So I went. What happened was she brought in her child who had a strep throat, and they diagnosed the child, and then they gave the child a freeze pop, one of those like push ice things,
like an otter pop, right?
Yeah. And Mom got really upset and said, "Why? Like, you should know better." And she started screaming at the nurse and kicked everyone out of the room, and was like, and they said everything was fine until we gave her child a popsicle. And I was like, yes, because in Mexican culture, we believe cold things will cause you to get sick and will cause a throat infection. And you just diagnosed their child with a throat infection and then gave them that. And so that's part of the interpreter's job too, is how do I explain this in a way that fits both cultures and that everyone understands, right? And it's also required. So that's the so it's required by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's required by the American Disabilities Act, and it's also required by the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't realize it was part of the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, I love the Affordable Care Act in terms of its interpretation. It's my favorite because they're much more, they say it directly, unlike the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Section 6, I get all excited about that section, it says that...
what a nerd.
I love it. They're like, you can't discriminate against a person based on national origin, and that got interpreted to include language. The Affordable Care Act says you can't discriminate based on language, and you have to provide an interpreter at no cost. So they're much more direct about it. The Civil Rights Act got interpreted legally, and the Affordable Care Act just came out and said it.
Well, I mean, there's so many loopholes that people can go through without the direct statement, right?
Yes.
And I'm sure that happened for decades.
It happens. It still happens. You also, I would see this with sign language. You would try to explain to people, no, you're required to provide an interpreter, and they said, no, that's just for Spanish. And I'm like, how did we, what? No.
What?
Right?
Oh.
So you see that. There's a lot of misunderstanding.
Is that why it's part of the Disability Act as well?
Yes. So the American Disabilities Act is the one that covers sign language, but not spoken language. But generally you'll see all three come together because also people that use sign language may also speak another language, right? So we get that too, where like the child is using sign language, the parents are speaking in Spanish, you need two interpreters.
Oh, wow. That must be really tricky.
Yes. Those are fun. I like those. One of my favorites.
I was going to say, have you been part of that before?
Yes, and my favorite, though, is two spoken words, because then you get to see all kinds of cultural things. I mean, you have cultural things with sign language, too, but so the one I've gotten to interpret the most, the largest community we had that I was dealing with, was Thai and Spanish. So usually one person was Thai, dad was Thai speaking and mom was Spanish speaking. And you would also see the argument, well, why did they need two interpreters? Like, because I was at Children's Hospital, they're like, they got along enough to make a baby, right? And I was like, you don't need language to make a baby.
Oh my God.
People are so gross.
Wait, these are doctors saying this?
Yeah.
Why are you surprised, Megan? You're always surprised when professionals are assholes.
Carrie. Carrie. I just expect better people.
No, Megan.
You always have to come and tell me that I shouldn't. But I know that it happens. Yeah.
I think Megan, if you really want to see the bias, it's when they call to request the interpreter, right? So I don't know how many times I've gotten requests for African, and I'm like, that's a really big place.
Yeah.
And so I've had requests for that. There was one where I was like, okay, Africa's a really big place. There's lots of countries and lots of languages, and I explained that to them, and I said, can you go back, ask again? And they said Ethiopian, and I was like, okay, we're getting better.
Okay.
I was like, I'm going to give you the top 3 languages spoken there. I want you to say these to the patient, and then if you see any kind of reaction, that's what we'll do, which they did do. So I went down there and met with the patient, and then I got accused of speaking Amharic, and I was like, I promise to God I do not speak Amharic. I just don't know anyone who doesn't know the name of their own language, right? Like, no matter how little you speak of the other language, you usually know the name of your country or the name of your language. Or you get that, which Jonathan, why am I forgetting Jonathan Rodriguez? No. Nelson Flores, Jonathan Rosa. I was going to do that thing where everyone mixes them up. Nelson Rosa. Jonathan Rosa with the looking like a language. I got a request, I'm going to make up the name. It was something like Maria Josefina de Jesus Contreras Rodriguez, and they're like, we need a Somali interpreter. And I was like, okay, that could happen, because maybe the Somali family took in this kid. I don't know. It happens.
Right. Yeah, it's possible.
It's possible. Yeah, right. So I requested
Unlikely.
Yes. So I requested the Somali interpreter to go visit with the family, and I asked the family if they want a Somali interpreter in English, because I don't know how to say that in Somali. And they look at me, and I say to them in Spanish, did you request a Somali interpreter? And they start to laugh, and we start speaking in Spanish. So they were from the Dominican Republic. They were black.
Oh. Okay.
But of all the countries, why Somalia?
Right.
That was the larger population of in that community of what was the second requested language. So usually people will just default to what they know, and they're like, so black must be Somali.
Right.
Oh.
Yes. So all of this is happening, right? All of this, in the medical setting, there's all of this assumptions and misinterpretations, and that means that people, their rights are being violated, right?
Yes.
If they're not getting what they need.
Yes. I was asked by a facility recently, because I was consulting for a hospital, they asked me if I thought a patient had been discriminated against. They had filed a complaint that they had been linguistically discriminated against, and therefore by national origin. And I said, I honestly think it would be very hard for any patient who speaks another language to not be discriminated against. At all.
Right.
We can start from the moment they arrive, right? So, was the consent form given to them in a language they understood? Were they literate in that language? Because that's also something else. Did someone explain it to them? And then the whole way through, right? So, the other thing is you get a lot of people who also think, with Spanish in the U.S., right? So, we have a lot more of Spanish in the U.S. That's the one we see the most. You have people who also think they know Spanish.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And can be very well-intentioned, but are not trained qualified interpreters. So that also, and it can put the patient at risk. It puts their care at risk.
Well, absolutely. And I'm thinking, I've seen this in Spanish departments where they have a class medical Spanish. And I mean, some people might actually think that's enough, right? That, someone who's studying to be a doctor or whatever.
I would like to beg all Spanish departments in the U.S. to please stop sending their students to volunteer at free clinics to interpret for Spanish.
Oh.
Ooh, yeah.
Ooh, yeah. Just because they're not trained properly.
They're not trained properly, and even if you've taken 3 years of college Spanish, that doesn't mean that you understand the cultural nuances of language. and definitely not at a medical care level. This is the reason why I train heritage language speakers to be interpreters, is because for a long time we also just used people, we're like, well, you have a college degree in Spanish, so you can be an interpreter, right? Or you married someone who speaks Spanish, you can be an interpreter.
Ha! I was going to say, my mom married someone who speaks Spanish. She could not be an interpreter.
Right.
Woo!
But the rules are changing. So there's like, for ASL, which is awesome, there's all kinds of standards in place. For spoken language, there's no national system or states. There's some states, Oregon and Washington are the only states, well, in California kind of, that have requirements for interpreters. So you can say they're required by law to be trained, but what does that mean? Or that they're required to be professional, but what does that mean?
Oh, so they don't spell that part out?
Correct. And it's not. There are places that there are companies, for-profit companies, that will test you in your language abilities and your medical interpretation abilities, but it's not standardized. So, yeah, I think that discrimination could be happening for sure in medical settings.
Well, I mean, it happens anyway, like, on so many different levels. Like, I would be surprised if it didn't happen along language lines. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How about race and culture alongside with language? How do they interact with healthcare accessibility?
Oh. I mean, I can't separate any of this. When people, this is the thing I hate about applied linguists, is that sometimes they'll be like, sometimes you just gotta look at the language and not the people. And it's like, that's not how language works, or people. So, for example, I remember one of our patients who required interpreters got in like a fender bender in the parking lot, right? And they didn't have a driver's license because they couldn't get one because they were undocumented. But their child had an appointment with oncology and had, treatments for their cancer, and so that took priority. And people were like, well, why didn't they take the bus to get here? And I'm like, because, well, their immune system's already down. Like, I'm kind of glad mom drove them in. It became this discussion, right? What was appropriate? Who was at fault? Should the parent have been doing that? But this is all while the child's trying to get care. And so then you have citizenship status, you have cultural beliefs of what's appropriate, medical beliefs of what's appropriate. Yeah, so it all interacts.
So this is affecting healthcare accessibility, which is life-threatening.
Oh, 100% is. And there's also fear of speaking up, right? That's a cultural thing too. I don't know how many times I've heard patients say, if I complain, they'll treat my child worse, or they'll treat me worse, and that's understandable. You don't want to upset the person your care is in the hands of. How do you know how to advocate in a culture that isn't yours? Who are you supposed to turn to? And even interpreters, right? Do the interpreters work for the hospital? Are you just gonna ask, like, and the role of the interpreter, so we do have like code of ethics and stuff, right? But it's not just, there's no standard exam for it, but the code of ethics say that as interpreters, we're not supposed to advocate for the patient.
Oh.
Right. So unless it's like something where I'm like, no, you're about to kill this person, right? So you don't advocate for them. ASL interpreters have a different, they're allowed to advocate. They're also considered advocates, but spoken interpreters are not.
So why? What's the difference there? What's the motivation?
The interpreters are just a tool so that they don't give any opinion for either, for the provider or the patient. You can occasionally act as a clarifier and say, let me clarify this. I probably do that more than most people. So like an example, I had a mom come in with her baby, and this was the 5th time in 3 days she had brought the baby to some kind of medical facility, and they had only been discharged for a couple days from the hospital. It was a newborn. So it was still the first week of this child's life. And so the doctor said, you're here for the belly button, looks at the belly button, says belly button's fine, and mom starts to cry and says, everyone says the belly button is fine. And I asked the doctor, can I have a moment? And I knew mom was from Mexico, and I said, are you afraid that your baby's not going to love you because of the belly button? And she said, yes. And I said, because it's sticking out? And she's like, yes. And I was like, okay. So no one had asked mom, and this would have been helpful, why are you upset, right? They just kept telling her, no, the belly button's fine. So in some Mexican cultures, my mom would always tell me, you can tell that I loved you because your belly button goes so far in. And this is common in some cultures in Mexico. But the mom was very isolated. It didn't have any like other moms around from her culture. And the belly button the umbilical cord falls off after a week or so. So it hadn't fallen off yet. On its own, it'll fall off. It was sticking out. Right? And mom's like, my child's umbilical cord is sticky. Like, it's very normal. But no one had asked, why are you worried? And I think that would have helped. And she had an interpreter for all of her appointments. But that was the other thing, right? All of the interpreters were from a Spanish-speaking country and culture that she was not from.
Not just in this situation, but I feel like it should be the case where in medical settings, you ask, what are you worried about? It just seems like a good question.
It is a really good question. Some people are trained to ask that. Some people aren't. Providers think they're doing the right thing, right? Like they told mom, just clean it off with a little bit of alcohol. It'll be fine. Like that's how you maintain it. I don't know.
Because they didn't see any threat, or any possible threat to the child.
Right.
Because they're working from their cultural context.
Yeah. Or if you think about like numbers too, right? I don't know if you know this. So in Mexican Spanish, we say every other day, we say cada tercer día, every third day. And we say every week, cada 8 días, 8 days. And every 2 weeks, cada 15 días, every 15 days. So if you told someone to take the medicine every other day or take this once a week, like you have to make sure that there's cultural understanding.
I mean, I'm not a medical doctor, but it seems so important to relay all this information properly. I just, have never thought about it. Not even for myself, really, because I'm in an English-speaking country, and English is the language I speak, and have never had to really think about whether or not I'm getting the information correctly from the doctor.
So some of the tests we do have, too, for interpreters focus on, which I hate, on, grammar, which is not relevant in in speaking in some ways, right? It's not that we don't have syntax, but we don't think about okay, don't end that sentence with a preposition kind of thing, right? Those kind of rules, not helpful. And so what they'll frequently do is hire people that have professional training in learning Spanish, but don't know the culture. And that's the part that I love with heritage language speakers is I didn't know my Spanish was valid until I started to study linguistics. And I was like, oh, wait, the way I speak is perfectly fine. My Spanish isn't bad. And it's like, no. Now I'm like, my Spanish is better than all my classmates because I grew up with it. It's not, it just is. It just is part of me. And so that was with the training with the people in Mexico City is that the first part of the course was kind of like an ethnic studies class, right? Your language is valid, your experiences are valid, and you actually make a better interpreter because you know these cultural things. The system is not set up for that.
No, not at all. I mean, it's not set up to even really interact with the patients on a human level. Yes, there are some doctors and some nurses who really do a good job, but I would say they're very much the exception because it's just in and out, in and out, in and out. Yeah, or when you talk about that in and out, there are good doctors, but when they say your kid's a little chubby, if I interpret that está gordito, culturally that's gonna be sweet, we're good to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know. Yes, this reminds me of how my cousin Gordo, I did not, because I grew up around Spanish but wasn't taught it, so I thought his real name was Gordo. And had no idea what it meant for a very long time. But, it's a term of endearment.
Yeah.
It used to be the case, even in Anglo culture, that you'd be really worried if the baby was too small, right?
Yeah.
So having a chubby child was actually a good thing until relatively recently.
Oh my goodness. I was interpreting for some very indigenous Mexicans. I'm 5'4". I don't know how tall Dad was, but I could definitely see the top of his head. And he was taller than Mom. So I'm going to say they were 4'8" and 4'10" maybe. I don't know. And Mom was very, very pregnant. Her due date was coming up and there was this last ultrasound. And they were concerned about the size of the baby. And they were saying, well, everything seems to have developed fine. The baby's just below the standard, right? The size. And I keep thinking, you're comparing them, the standard that you use on fetal length is not appropriate for this context, right?
Yeah.
But I can't say that. My job is just to speak. And I keep wanting to say can someone look at the height of the parents? If everything looks healthy and is developed and it's just smaller, that makes sense since Dad's 4'10" and Mom's 4'8". I think another one where we also, the growth chart, from what I was explained by a physician, the growth chart we use for pediatrics is based on 100 white children in Colorado.
100?
Yeah. And I was like, oh boy. That seems problematic. So maybe you have like a growth development issue, but do you? Like, and that's something I don't interpret.
That must be so frustrating.
Yes. Oh, you'll love this too. Development, right? So you interpret development questions. One of the development questions in pediatrics, like around age 3 or 4, is your child adding on S's to pluralize?
What?
Okay, even if I interpret that correctly, like if I'm a Mandarin Chinese interpreter, they don't add S's on to pluralize, and the child is not going to, so mom's, dad, whatever, caregiver is going to say no, and they didn't hit the milestone.
Right.
That is wildly inappropriate.
Yes.
Even in French, where the S comes from originally, they don't pronounce it anymore. So, like, not even, like, only English. What is this?
Right.
Oh,
yeah.
But if you only speak English and you're a provider and you're like, I have to go through these questions and make sure your kid's fine, and I have an interpreter here, I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to do, right? We study language, we're like, no!
I'm just thinking, like, it seems so inappropriate that these language questions are being forced upon, like, medical doctors to kind of, like, interpret as, like, developmentally appropriate. I mean, I really don't like that.
No, they're the wrong people to be asking those questions.
They really, really are.
We don't need them to be experts in everything anyway.
No!
So, like,
no.
Don't ask the language questions, at least not at that level. Like, maybe it's worrying if they're not speaking at all.
Exactly.
Right.
With all of this, let's talk COVID-19.
Okay.
And healthcare accessibility. How do you think that the United States has handled information dissemination about COVID in languages other than English?
I haven't seen any.
Okay, it's non-existent.
So it exists. I'm sure it exists. Just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't. But all that I've seen has been published by other places, right? So one of the assignments I just gave my students was to find that, my heritage language students. And everything that they gave me was from other countries in Spanish. Even though these are students who, like, live in the Midwest in the U.S. and, like, I don't think it's getting out there. Yeah, it's not. And this is, again, with that intersection, like you asked, Carrie, about, like, race, right? And we know, for example, the COVID-19 spots are located, the inoculation locations are in white areas, right? How much information is getting, like, let's say you even got to the site and you spoke Spanish. I'm not sure you're going to understand when to come back or any of the things they're going to give you, or no, we're doing a terrible job.
Well, we were already doing the United States was already doing a terrible job in English. It was such a disaster for like many of my friends who were lucky to get vaccinated kind of early, couldn't figure out when they were supposed to get their second shot. They've worked it out since, but if it was a disaster in English, I can only imagine how much worse it is in any other language.
Oh, the online stuff too, right? To sign up.
Yep.
Then we have the digital divide. Like, who has access to that? Who knows how to navigate that? So you have, like, it becomes the younger generation. You got to get your, like, kids or your grandkids to help you. And even then, if you don't have access to it. So there's someone sitting in the suburbs with their, like, iPad, their laptop, and their phone hitting refresh.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what I did. I was, like, having to click refresh to see new appointments coming up. And I knew how to do that for myself. And I got signed up. But, if you can't do that, and if your child is trying to do that for you, and, what a clusterfuck.
It is a total
cluster. It's a total cluster.
Are there any interpreters on site at these vaccine?
I doubt it.
I have not seen any, and I have not heard of that from friends. I'm sure, but there's gotta be, but not that I know. And when I say there's gotta be, I mean that there might be one. But I mean, in the whole United States, is there a site that has an interpreter? Probably. That's why there's gotta be one.
Yeah, that's true.
Do I think the sites all have them? Oh, hell no. They can't even get interpreters in their emergency rooms. They're not going to do it out in a COVID site. Which is just crazy to me, right? Because you need it for all languages. But Spanish, we have so many Spanish speakers. Why is this so difficult for us to, like, catch on? Yeah.
And is there any shortage of interpreters that speak Spanish? Or is it just we're not reaching out to them?
No, interpreters totally exist. I think people don't want to pay for them. So when I started interpreting, because you're required to, right? You're federally required to. It's seen as a cost expense. So sometimes it's easier to pay fines than it is to do the right thing. I'm thinking of our friend Juan Luna, who took his grandparents to get vaccinated, and there weren't interpreters for them, and they were in, Long Beach, LA area.
Which there should be interpreters, right?
Right. You would think, or providers that spoke Spanish. Like,
yeah.
You get in this line, the person giving you your shot speaks Spanish to tell you wait 15 minutes or whatever. Yeah, I don't know.
But the people that are giving shots aren't all nurses. Like,
right.
All of this, right? So
correct,
it's like there's a lot of volunteers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they're actually mostly volunteers because they can't really afford to have all the nurses out.
Right. We also have phone and video interpretation, which is widely used in the U.S., which is great, I think, for languages that are less requested. Spanish is going to be more requested, but maybe there's not a lot of, people from Ghana in your community, so not a lot of Chui, right? So you're going to see this once every 10 years or something. Then you use phone or video, and those are also available. So they could have phone interpretation at those sites. Corporations like phone and video because they think it's less expensive.
I was going to ask, is it?
I think they've been hoodwinked, a lot of them. So for one of the hospitals that I just went in and did consulting for, they were certain that phone and video is less expensive, and it's more expensive than actually hiring a staff interpreter. And that was with benefits and everything. And the great thing about a staff interpreter is that they know the staff. So they know what you're actually, they start to learn the culture of the place, and they learn what you're actually trying to ask when a medical provider asks something. They know how to get around the facility instead of trying to find a place where the phone and video. That's the other thing. The phone and video are usually connected to the internet. So if your internet's shaky or it's being interrupted by other machines, which happens a lot in hospitals, the connection's really bad. And we don't have really good rules about that either. The leaders in ASL have made room for spoken language. So with ASL, the screen has to be so big, a certain size, and if it gets interrupted by so many seconds or whatever, it's hard to understand, you immediately have to provide an in-person interpreter.
And this is because of advocates, deaf advocates, working to get this kind of stuff.
Yes, it's totally from advocates. And it's the same thing. I think that's what happened with spoken language, is that ASL advocated a lot, and then you get space for spoken language. Because, again, I think race plays into this. And this is where I'd like to see research, if anybody wants to do research on this. I think the advocacy that creates spaces for white people, and then other people can kind of move in a little bit into that space. Did we talk about this before, Megan? I don't know. I think it's white ASL speakers that made... Not that other people aren't fighting and speaking loudly. I just think white people are listened to more.
I want to actually talk really quick about actual patients who have COVID and healthcare accessibility. Okay, so what's happening to them in the hospitals or in the doctor's rooms? What's happening to them?
So very similar in some ways to English-speaking patients where they're isolated from family, right? So you don't get to communicate with anyone. And communication's even harder. So even if you have a liaison that calls into the hospital and speaks, getting through is much harder when you also have family members who don't speak the language and are trying to figure out how to get information about their family member, right? Also, there's these consults when they know it's going to be end of life. Those consults are really hard because they're still being done by phone and video, and then there's an interpreter. Right, the interpreter may be present with the patient or with the physician or the team, right? But the family isn't necessarily there. Or maybe the interpreter will go with the family and they'll phone and video into the patient because they're trying to keep people separated. There's a lot of misunderstanding of why that's going on, right? If you don't, even for English-speaking patients, right? Or family members, they want to see their family. And because you already probably don't trust the system, and now they're not letting you see the person, your belief of what's actually going on, I think, diminishes.
So you're not trusting the situation.
Right. You're telling me my parent is dying, but I don't know any of this system or what's going on, and you won't let me see them. I don't know if this is really true.
Do you think this is leading people to not seek help? Medical help?
No, I think other things get them to not seek medical help. So health insurance, or will someone speak the language? Will I get deported? I don't want to put my family through this.
And so this is, the COVID death rate is probably much higher. People are dying at home.
Yes. And there's a misconception. I think people think that medical providers are very altruistic and knowing and understanding. And I don't know how many times I've heard medical providers say, well, if they just didn't party so much, or it's because they all live in close, it's not that racism is the reason we're more likely to get COVID. It's not because we are that's the missing piece. And so yes, you'll have disproportionate amount of Latino patients, or, as the system likes to say, Hispanic patients on the floor. that there's not an understanding by the medical providers of why those patients are there, or they don't wear masks. And I think what we've actually found is that the Latinos are more likely to wear masks, right? Or they'll be like, well, they're out working in the field. And I'm like, you're not familiar with field work, are you? Because they think that's what's getting them exposed. I mean, it kind of is that they're being around people, but it's not. There's racism here, right? I want to scream that all the time. So, there's a misunderstanding of why it's disproportionately us.
I mean, it's usually the answer in situations. What's happening here? Racism.
I had one of the administrators push back on me because I said that. I was like, this is racism. And she's like, I'd like to push back on that. And I was like, okay, systemic racism.
Is that better?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
So it happens. So this is again where ASL is great, is the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, right? They've required that. So people that have been tubed, they can't talk. And so they're supposed to have signs they can point at. And it needs to be big, and it also and it'll be like a yes and a no, which is in English. They're supposed to provide those in these languages of the patients, and they don't. Also, if patients come in, I saw this with a Tagalog-speaking patient. They thought they were Spanish-speaking for the longest time. But because the patient wasn't responding because they couldn't, they were being spoken to in a language they didn't speak, even though they were using interpreters, right? The same thing happens with indigenous communities, right? Maybe they'll speak Mixteco or Zapoteco or something, and it's seen as like, I saw this with an article that said, there isn't language outreach in Spanish, and they're like, a dialect of Spanish.
Oh! That bugs me so much. I can't.
Yeah. And I was like, no, it's totally different languages. So even in interpreting services in hospitals, they'll think that, like I did a training, the interpreters thought that Zapoteco was a variation of Spanish. And these are all certified interpreters. It was a state that requires certification. And I tried to explain to the interpreters, I was like, no, that like they're very different languages, and that there may be some contact, which that was one of the arguments. They're like, no, they're the same, because I've heard them say pastilla when they're speaking.
Oh my God.
And I was like, which pastilla means pill, right, for the listeners. So in languages that come in contact, we pick up words from each other. That does not mean that the person now speaks Spanish because they pulled a word from Spanish, right? If I say c'est la vie, I don't now speak French.
Well, I mean, we'd all be French speakers because how many words have we borrowed from
exactly
from French? Jesus.
Right, exactly. And so the interpreters had to learn that. That was part of our training. So if your interpreters don't know it, I don't know how the rest of the medical staff is going to understand. There's lots of languages, right? And lots of cultures within languages. There was one I enjoyed too in an emergency room where they hadn't utilized me, and I went and asked why. And the doctor said, oh, she's white. And I was like, I'm sorry? So the patient was white from Argentina and was vacationing in the U.S. and had ended up in the emergency room. And they did not speak English, but the provider just felt like, well, they're white, so therefore they understand English.
Amazing. Amazing. That is like, I don't even know what to do with that. That's a myth I have not yet encountered.
I'm not surprised. Carrie, look, I'm not surprised. Look at me.
No. Megan, you're losing your Meganness.
One more kind of wrap-up question. In an ideal world, how would this rollout of vaccines or the information dissemination about COVID and vaccines look like?
You'd have people way smarter than me that are actually connected with the community doing it, right? So your federally qualified health centers, your like low income and free clinics, asking them and their people, like, how do we get this information out? Because they're actually connected and they're everywhere, and getting the information to them. And then I would have things, so translation is written word, right? And interpretation is spoken word, is if we could have everything translated into the like top 10 languages. If they have, and here's the other thing, right? If they have a written language, that would be great. And then getting the information out the way we do with other social media stuff, right? But in the languages we need to get them out in.
It seems so simple, and yet, I mean, it's not happening.
First of all, the whole thing was a disaster.
Oh,
so.
yeah.
But yeah, it costs money, although not tons if you're only doing 10 languages and all you're doing is like this packaged information.
Right.
That's not extensive, but it still costs money, and someone has to like make a bunch of calls, and
calls. Oh, all the calls. Yeah.
I mean, and even with the languages, right? Like, Houston has a huge Vietnamese population. Maybe that's where I want to send it, and Vietnamese papers, and not to, like, Duluth. I don't know, right? Watch Duluth have a huge Vietnamese population, and someone messaging.
Yeah. I don't know.
I don't know. I said that. I'm sorry if you're out there. I'm sure there are people out there. But probably not as big as Houston's. Or, a Somali community is probably not as big in Houston as it is in Minneapolis. We know they're, right? So, yeah, if you can just get it out in the languages of the communities, that would be great. And a sign-up system that wasn't online, so if they could sign up. So if you could just go into one of those qualified centers and, like, tell them, and they'll sign you up, right? That would be great.
Well, thank you for doing the work that you're doing. I mean, it's such important work, and we really appreciate you talking to us about this. I think it's just so important that people realize that if you think it's been a clusterfuck for you, and you're like, it's your language that you speak, or whatever. It's only worse. It's worse, and awareness is key, or the first step at least. And so thank you for talking to us today about medical interpretation and COVID, and so great to have you.
Can I do one little shout out? Because I should have said it earlier, because I really want them to get business, is the interpreting co-op, so run by all repatriated people, deported people, is called Dreamers Interpretation.
Oh, nice. I like that.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. And we leave our listeners with one final message.
Don't be an asshole.
Don't be an asshole.
Oh, that's my favorite.
We have 3 people to thank this month. We'd like to thank Daniel Kilby, who actually has been a supporter for a while, but he upped his monthly donation, so he gets a shout out.
Thank you.
Robin Gentry.
Yay.
And Carolog Adventures in English.
Oh, fun. Thank you so much. We appreciate it so much.
Yeah, we really do. And for those who want to join us at www.patreon.com/vocalfriespod, you can get a huge backlog of bonus episodes. And at the $3 and $5 levels, you get a sticker.
Yay.
So thank you.
Thank you.
The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by me, Carrie Gillen, for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com, and our website is vocalfriespod.com.